Well, we talked briefly about your Vanderbilt career, but would you mind going over sort of, when you started undergrad, how you decided to come back?
I came to Nashville in 1960. That and We joke about the fact that the class of 1964, whenever we have reunions, it sounds like we were in the 60s, but we were really, as we like to say, lost in the 50s. We hadn't really gotten out of the 50s when I got here. I majored in history. I hadn't really thought about going to law school terribly seriously until I was doing an honors program with the English history professor. Turns out he was about to take a sabbatical and hadn't told me, and he proposed to turn me over to the Italian Renaissance professor. While, for my senior year, I would have done 12 hours. And the Renaissance guy, Dayton Phillips, was a great guy, but I really didn't have any desire to, try to do English history under an Italian Renaissance history professor. So I went down to the law school. We had a family friend down there who was the dean of admissions, and you could go into law school back in those days as a senior in absentia. What I didn't know going down there was that there was a quota on the number of women that were allowed into first-year law every year, and the number was 3. And if I hadn't had the connection with him, I don't know whether I would have been one of the 3 or not. So I started law school in 1963, the fall of 1963, but I didn't get my BA until the following spring. And so I managed to get both degrees in 6 years of study, but since I got married and had a baby in the middle of the law school thing, it took a little longer. I was out a couple of years. No, it's hard for you to believe, Mary, but there was nothing in Nashville that carried the title daycare, and so people were hiring nannies or, getting their aunt to keep the baby or whatever, and so we didn't have the money to hire a nanny, so I just took 2 years out of law school. And then there was a little school that's not very far from here, a little day school, and if you had the child potty trained and out of diapers, they would let them come as young as 2. So Carrie, my daughter, was turning 2 at the end of July that year, and I wanted to go back to law school, and they had made the scholarship still available to me. And so I set her down in June, and I said, now I don't want to put you under any pressure, but we've got 3 months for you to do this. And she did. So she was able to get into this little day school, and I was able to go back to law school. So that's that story.
Did you see that a lot in your time at Vanderbilt? Students would, take time off to be married, have children?
Yeah, but, the women who got married during their undergraduate years pretty much disappeared off campus. And if you got pregnant and weren't married, you really disappeared off campus. That was just not even a possibility. Most of the students who got married were married somebody in medical school and then got a job helping them get through medical school. And remember, in the entire law school, there would only be 9 women at most, 3 in each class. So there wasn't a lot of getting married back in those days. I had a beau who graduated 2 years before me, and he was working for the Tennessean when he had to go off to the National Guard or get drafted and sent to Vietnam, and that's when we got married, was sort of during that period of time.
I guess I lost my question. Oh, but you said there were 9 women in the law school maximum at a time.
Yeah.
Out of how many in a class was that?
Well, 3 out of about 130.
Oh, wow.
And the really bad thing was they split us up. So I was the only woman in my section, and the other 2 women were in the other section. And It was a little rough. It really was. The uh, the men, nobody. I don't think they resented us for taking up a seat that a male student might have had. I think they just sort of ignored us and thought we were maybe a little unusual. But it the professors, I think, there was some problem with the professors. There were there was sort of a ladies' day thing where they actually did call on all the women in one day and get it over with. Didn't happen to me because I was the only woman in the class. I was my own ladies' day, I guess.
Did you have any female professors?
No, none. In fact, when I came back to the law school 7 years after I graduated, I was the first woman on the faculty, the first woman in a tenure track appointment to the faculty. So, no, there weren't. And even more puzzling than that, in undergraduate school, in 3 years of undergraduate school, I had only one woman professor, and she was my math professor my freshman year. There was a woman in the biology department who was pretty well known. And honestly, except for the nursing school, that was it. I mean, the campus was unbelievably male, unbelievably white male. And there was a quota in the undergraduate school, too. We couldn't understand why all the women who were in that first year class had been valedictorian, salutatorian, editor of the newspaper, whatever. But the reason was that there were I don't know for sure what the ratio was, but there was probably no more than 2 out of every 5 students were women, and they kept a cap on it. And so the women came in with much higher credentials than the young men did.
And was this something you discussed while you were an undergraduate?
No. The thing we railed against was that the men students had no hours and we had curfews, and that there was a lot more talk about that than there was. It was the old in loco parentis kind of thing, and our point was if the reason that the women have to be in at a certain hour, even on the weekends, is because something might happen with the boys. Maybe they ought to make the boys stay in and let the women run wild.
Walking around campus at night, did you ever feel...
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel nervous about your...
No. Things were... if there were sexual assaults of the kind that you now see going on then, it just was never discussed. I'm pretty sure there might have been some of that going on, but it was just not discussed, and it would have been blamed on the co-ed if it had been going on. And I'm looking at your jeans. We were not allowed to wear pants of any kind unless we were going to a picnic, and then we could wear Bermuda shorts. But we had to wear a raincoat over it until we got off campus.
Huh.
So.
Did the men have any dress code?
No, of course not.
Of course not. I'm sure you didn't have rips in your pants.
Oh my gosh, no.
Scandalous. Do you have any particularly happy memories of your time at undergraduate?
Oh yeah. I was active in. I eventually pledged Pi Phi, and I've remained close to my sorority sisters. We always have the largest contingent coming back to reunion. I was active in the Student Senate, for example. I got elected to the Student Senate and became the first woman ever to hold office in the Student Senate. They wouldn't let me be president, but they let me be president pro tem, whatever that meant. I'm not exactly sure what it did mean, but if the president didn't show up at a meeting, I guess I got to preside. So, and I made great grades. I was first in my class when I left to go to law school, and because those grades in law school transferred over as hours, but not any points for the ABC. I ended up they transferred as D's, so I got the hours to graduate, but I dropped from summa cum laude down to cum laude, which was, I thought, fine. I mean, I don't know that I ever would have gone to law school if I hadn't gotten in when I did the way I did. So,
was your choice to transition from being an undergraduate to a law student during your senior year, was that encouraged by your mentors, or?
No. In fact, the pre-law advisor was a political science professor who, I think they had some sort of celebration for him not too long ago. And it was his position that women shouldn't go to law school. And so once I found out that he had taken that position, that was the end of my doing any pre-law counseling. As I say, we had the friend of the family that was the dean of admissions. That was good enough for me. So that's how all that happened.
And did you decide in law school that you wanted to pursue a career in private practice? Did you want to be a judge at that time?
Oh, I was going to law school to practice in a firm. There weren't any big law firms in Nashville at the time. So what turned out to be the case was that I couldn't get a job with a law firm. I eventually got a position with one of the banks, which isn't here any longer, Commerce Union. But what they wanted me to do was banking, and I would have been willing to go into their trust department and deal with the legal stuff in the trust department. But I had a gentleman inform me that they were quite sure that the people in the trust department wouldn't want a woman lawyer because most of their clients were widows, and widows, of course, would want to deal with a man and not deal with a woman. So it just happened time and time again. There was one interview where the fella asked me why I was in law school, and I told him that I wanted to practice law. This was a banking person, not a private practice person. And I said, I didn't come looking for a husband. I'm already married. I already have a child. That's not it. I would just like to practice law. And he said to me, well, he said, in order to work in our trust department, you'd have to be an officer, a bank officer, and we don't have women bank officers. So it was, you were just kind of bumping up against that kind of thing constantly. I was furious, and we were actually doing business with that bank at the time. Not much business, Mary. It was a checking account and maybe a little something in a savings account. But I marched into the branch where we did our banking business out in Belmead the next day and demanded to withdraw my accounts. And and the woman that I was dealing with, the teller, said, well, you'll have to, do this with the manager. And so I went over and met the manager, and he had the gall to ask me why I was closing my accounts, and boy, did I land on him. I just let him have it. And then I avoided him like the plague. I still remember his name, avoided him like the plague for years after that.
Was your spouse supportive?
Oh, yes. I was in law school. I had started law school about the time he proposed, and so he knew it was going to be a little unusual, and he was always supportive. He was a newspaper reporter. He was a great guy and a wonderful writer, and we were married 53 years. He died last year.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Was he also a Vanderbilt student?
He was, but he had only one undergraduate degree, and I'm a double door, and my daughter's a double door, and he kind of felt like he was letting down the family tradition because he only had one Vanderbilt degree. So we were scholarship students. He was on the Grantland Rice scholarship. He'd come from Texas, from a family of very limited means, and I was also a scholarship student, and back in those days, you got scholarships. You didn't have to take out loans, and that was good because once I got out of law school, I couldn't get hired anywhere, and it was lucky I didn't have $150,000 worth of student loans to pay off.
Was it a scholarship that had any particular meaning behind it?
No, it was just an academic. It was a combination of academics and need. I will tell you this though, which is a story I love to tell. I was on a full tuition scholarship in undergraduate school, and I was a resident RA, a resident advisor, which paid for the dorm for a couple of years. When I got to law school, it turned out that the law school discounted scholarships for women. If you had the academics and the need as a male student, you could get 100%, full tuition scholarship. But if you were a woman, there was a 25% discount, and so the most you could get was 75% scholarship. And if you asked why that was, and they would say, well, you're a girl, and we'd look down and say, you're right, we are girls, but we didn't know what else to do. And I've got an old friend who graduated at the same time I did, who's practicing law here in Nashville, and she was a scholarship student too, and she had very good grades and should have gotten a full tuition scholarship. And the very last semester, she found out that they weren't going to let her graduate because she hadn't paid the 25% of tuition that didn't come with the scholarship. And she went in the dean's office and told him she was going to scream and yell and cry and fall on the floor if he didn't call the registrar and let her graduate. And he said, oh my God, don't cry, don't do anything but don't cry. And with her standing there, he called the registrar at the law school and said, let this person graduate, I'm canceling the whatever she owes. So she came running down to me. We used to meet in this single bathroom. It had a sitting area, and then it had the john and the sink. And there was some old wrought iron patio furniture in there, and there were so few of us that we could all get in there between classes and sit and chat. So we all were friends. We all knew, pretty much what was going on. She came running down there to find me, and she said, have you paid that last, however many $100 it was? And I said, oh yeah, I've already paid it. And she said, I wish you hadn't, because you could go up there and threaten to cry and scream and yell and he wouldn't make you pay it. And I said, well, okay, I'm a little too proud to do that. But so this stuff was the second class citizenship that we all were involved in was just pervasive. It was everywhere. I couldn't get a job because I was told by a law firm person that I was trying to get an interview with that the law firm wasn't big enough to hire somebody to sit in the library and do research all day, and they were quite sure that their clients wouldn't want to deal with a woman. And I think at that time the largest firm in town was Bass, Berry and Sims. I think it's still probably the largest private law firm in town. And they had no more than about 12 or 14 lawyers in the whole thing. And most of their expansion was through nepotism. Somebody's son graduated from law school, or somebody's daughter married a nice boy that had just graduated from law school, and they got taken into the firm. But I couldn't even get an interview. And I think I was maybe sixth in my class coming out of law school, but doors were shut. That's all there was to it.
What was your first big breakthrough?
Well, really the first one was because my husband's editor at the Tennessean, and by the way, the Tennessean in those days was a really good newspaper, just in case anybody wonders. He was friends with the man who was, I think, maybe golfing or tennis friends with the guy who was the U.S. attorney. And as it happened, that's the fall of 1968, and we were about to have a presidential election. And in the old days when that happened and the White House changed hands, it wasn't just the U.S. attorney who got moved out. It was the entire office that got moved out. And so the young men that might have been interested in going to work in the U.S. Attorney's Office were unsure of how that election was going to come out and were unwilling to make the commitment to come in and work there, knowing that it might be only a matter of months before they had to leave. I wasn't that picky. I was desperate, and the U.S. Attorney at the time was Gil Merritt, who is on the Sixth Circuit Court with me now. He got on a lot sooner than I did, but we've got offices next door to each other. And he was the lawyer in town who was willing to hire a young woman. And so that was the beginning. Now, we lost the election. Nixon came in. I had been taken in as a Democrat, and but I went from there to the state district attorney's office, who was a good Democrat, and had 3 openings. If it had been just one, I'm not sure I would have, been considered. But he had 3 openings and needed people to come in there. So I went from the federal prosecutor to the state prosecutor. Was really what had happened. That was the beginning of some firsts. There had never been a woman prosecutor that we know of in the history of the state of Tennessee, either state or federal. And then I went to the Vanderbilt faculty, where there had never been a woman, so I was the first woman in there. And then I went from the faculty at Vanderbilt on to the Court of Criminal Appeals of Tennessee. There'd never been a woman on a court of record in Tennessee, meaning the trial court or appellate courts. We'd had a general sessions judge for about a year in Clarksville, and there was, I understand there was a law-trained juvenile court judge up in the Tri-Cities area. But I was the first law-trained woman in on a court of record, and therefore the first woman to hold statewide office. Then I went to the Supreme Court of Tennessee, where there had never been another woman, so I was the first there. And I went from there to the Sixth Circuit, where thankfully there were already 2 women, and it had been one even earlier than that. So I was the 4th woman to serve on that court. Being the first woman in is not much fun. It really turned out to be, I stayed angry for a long time. And I had the distinct impression that there were men where I got in who were not really very comfortable with my being there.
Did you have a strategy for proving them wrong?
Well, what happens, yeah, you work really hard. I've got a poster in my bathroom at work that says, women have to work. This is from about that era. Women have to work twice as hard to get half as far, but luckily it's not difficult to do for women. So you just had to get in and hunker down and do it. People have said, what was it about your personality that made you willing to get battered around time after time? And I said it has something to do with that old thing you used to hear when you were a child about no girls allowed. The sign on the treehouse door, no girls allowed. Or being told that girls couldn't do that, and I just somehow had a natural sense of rebellion about that. On the other hand, there were times when it wasn't fun. While I was teaching in law school, there were several men on the faculty, at least 3 or 4, who thought I had gotten on. There wasn't anything called affirmative action in those days, but they thought I had somehow taken advantage of the system to get on the faculty. And they weren't hostile, but they certainly didn't treat me as a colleague. And I, on the other hand, had, gotten into feminism, which was occurring at the time, and I took it upon myself to educate these guys, which probably didn't help their attitude toward me at all. But so we would get into these discussions in the faculty lounge, and when the blow-ups would come, I would storm out of there and go back to my office and, mutter to myself, I don't have to take this, yob, yob, yob. And, uh, and I'm not going back in there. That's it. I've had it with those guys. And then, 2 or 3 days later, when I'd calmed down, I'd realized if I wasn't in there, there wouldn't be a woman in there and the conversations wouldn't happen. And so I would pull myself together and go back to the faculty lounge. There was a lot of that went on, just kind of bumping your head against the wall. And that's what it takes. My whole philosophy was, yeah, okay, I'll do what it takes to get in, but then I was very careful to make sure somebody was coming behind me. And so when I left the DA's office, I made sure that the DA hired a woman to replace me and so forth. I just seemed my responsibility. And then all of a sudden I looked around 10 years later and, there were a lot of women in that office. So it paid off. It really did.
As a faculty member, did you feel a certain responsibility to your female law students?
Oh, yeah, no question about it. The law school at that time had pretty much an open door facility and or policy, and mine was always open. And so I did a lot of mentoring. I'm not even sure we called it mentoring back in those days. Counseling, come in, what's bothering you? Let's talk about it. And after a while, some of the male students realized that they could get some help if they'd ask for it. And so I started getting the men students coming in. I'd like to take this job as a public defender, but I've also got an offer. That's a $20,000 a year job, and I've got this $60,000 a year offer. And, just career counseling. And I had one fellow land in my office saying, I can't take any of this anymore. I'm dropping out of law school. And I said, okay, let's talk about it. And he's a lawyer in Nashville to this day. So, yeah, it was. But the women were where my heart was. And we started the Women Law Students Association in those days. They liberated the men's bathroom on the main floor. They put up a sign that said it was a unisex bathroom, and no man ever went in there again. That was the end of it. So, yeah, it was an interesting time to be both a student and a faculty member on the campus.
Yeah. Did you get to take on that mentorship role at all as an RA? Did you?
No. What the women in the dorm seemed to want was just to be left alone more than anything. So, and I disliked the part of it where I was supposed to go. Have you been in a dorm on campus before? Do they still make the RAs come and inspect your room?
Yeah.
Whew, I would have thought that was gone. I hated that. I really did hate that. Because these were my friends and my sorority sisters. It was that part of it was not pleasant. I'm surprised they still do that. But anyway, I got through all that and got through law school and went on with the career, and sort of the end of the story.
You made sure the people behind you also had, had steps to be on.
Absolutely. I remember in the DA's office, one of the assistants who was there when I was there and has since become my dear friend, but he came to me and said, I don't think you're going to ever make it in this profession if you keep eating lunch with the girls. And by the girls, he meant the secretaries. I said, Bob, let me tell you something. You all are going out to lunch together, and you're not inviting me. What am I supposed to do? Sit at the desk by myself, or enjoy my lunch with who's left in the office? After all, you all go off by yourself. The young lawyers in town were in something called the Barristers Club, and they didn't take women. The whole thing was just sort of pervasive. And there were restaurants downtown. The balcony of one of them was for men only, and then there was the Satsuma restaurant that had a men's table. I don't remember whether I was involved in integrating the balcony or not, but I do know I was the one that sat at the men's table and got that taken care of. So, and this didn't win us a lot of friends. The women who were really active and pushing, it didn't win you a lot of friends with the older lawyers in town. And when I ran for the Supreme Court, it was an open election. They were partisan. We were Democratic nominees that year. And I got the nomination by running against a very well-respected man who was on the court at the time. And I got the nomination and he didn't. I mean, that really did it with the carriage trade lawyers in town. That was, But what they didn't realize was on the Democratic State Executive Committee who made the nominations was a woman who was a trial judge in Franklin, a Vanderbilt graduate who was a trial judge in Franklin, Tennessee. This was it was about 1990. And she was both a trial judge and a member of the executive committee, and all she did was defer to me. I mean, she would have gotten that seat if I hadn't run. But I'd been out there ahead of her, and she was willing to let me take a shot at it. Grateful I am for the fact that she eventually got on the Supreme Court herself and actually became Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court. It was after I was gone, but at least, she got her shot later on. But you couldn't explain that to the older lawyers and the officers of the bar associations and all. They just were aghast that I would have the gall to, run against that beloved judge. But the truth was we were going to have a woman on the Supreme Court that year, and it was just a question of who.
Did you feel like your Vanderbilt experience, both as an undergraduate and sort of fighting against the mainstream in the law school, shaped the way that you approached conversations with male colleagues later on and sort of challenging that status quo?
Indubitably.
Yeah.
I can't dredge up any examples for you, but you just float along doing it. And when I got on the first court that I sat on, there were at least two guys on there, two judges who'd been there a while, who really were sort of self-important. They were judges, after all, on a court of appeals, yada, yada, yada. And then all of a sudden it becomes apparent that a 33-year-old girl could do the same thing, and it was, I think, threatening. So there was this understanding that on some level the men were being threatened by the fact that the women wanted in. There was also this lovely man on the court at that time whose children had come through Vanderbilt. He was from Shelbyville, and he just took me under his wing. I mean, he came out to the law school to meet me after I got the nomination, or got the appointment before I started, and wanted to know if I had questions, and of course I did. And he was lovely. Not everybody was, but you run into, even if you're kind of, as they say, you better get out of the wheat field, Annie. You're going against the grain. And even so, there's going to be one lovely person who's willing to help you out.
Those lovely people in your undergraduate experience, did you mostly find them, within your sorority? Was there kind of a community there?
Yeah. There was an understanding. The feeling was that women were at Vanderbilt to study in order to become better mothers and wives and, all of that. And so if you wanted to go, there wasn't a lot of encouragement to go to graduate school. I talked to my English history guy about trying to get a Marshall Fellowship, and he explained to me that women didn't qualify for a Marshall. They didn't qualify for Rhodes at the time. What he didn't tell me was that there were Fulbright scholarships to study abroad. He just didn't share that information with me, and it was a lot later before I found out that that might have been a possibility. Because I was thinking of trying to study in England some and teach, and that's the career that went down the tubes because there wasn't nurturing and mentoring and encouragement to women to go to graduate school at the time.
Are you regretful that you couldn't pursue that career?
No, I think I ended up in a pretty good place. Although I must say, having walked away from the faculty at the law school, I come back on this campus, especially in the spring,